What if everything you thought you knew about the Renaissance was only half the story? Picture this: a time of dazzling art, revolutionary science, and towering intellects, but beneath the surface, secrets swirl in the shadows, mysteries even modern scholars struggle to unravel. The Renaissance wasn't just about bright colors and bold ideas. It was a labyrinth of hidden origins, coded messages, and unexpected twists that still leave historians scratching their heads today. This era, so often celebrated for its beauty, holds puzzles that could rewrite history as we know it. Think about the Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile or the intricate symbolism in Botticelli's paintings. These aren't just masterpieces. They're whispers from the past, clues left behind by minds playing a deeper game. Behind every brushstroke, every scientific breakthrough, there are stories of intrigue, rivalry, and sometimes even deception. The Renaissance was a stage where genius and mystery collided, where the line between art and code, science and secrecy, blurred in ways that still captivate us centuries later. So why does this matter now? Because unraveling these riddles isn't just about digging up the past. It's about understanding how a single explosion of creativity reshaped the world. The Renaissance gave us telescopes and sonnets, anatomy lessons and hidden maps, but it also left behind questions that refused to stay quiet. What if Da Vinci's notebooks hold more than just inventions? What if the Medici family's rise to power wasn't just about money, but something far more unexpected? Over the next few minutes, we're pulling back the curtain on 30 astonishing facts that reveal the Renaissance as you've never seen it, full of shadows, surprises, and secrets waiting to be uncovered. This isn't just history, it's a detective story, and you're invited to help solve it. Here's something that might surprise you: the people living through the Renaissance never actually called it that. The word itself, meaning rebirth, didn't come into use until the 19th century, when French historian Jules Michelet first used it to describe this explosive period of cultural revival. Imagine an entire era defining itself without its now iconic name. Michelet saw this period as Europe waking from the so-called Dark Ages, a time when art, science, and philosophy suddenly surged forward with breathtaking energy. But here's the twist: his label wasn't just a neutral description. It was a bold statement, framing the Renaissance as a triumphant return to classical greatness after centuries of stagnation. This framing stuck, shaping how we view the era even today. Think about it: calling it a rebirth implies something was lost and then rediscovered, a narrative that paints the Middle Ages as shadowy and unremarkable in contrast. But historians now debate whether that's entirely fair. Some argue the Renaissance wasn't so much a sudden explosion as it was a gradual evolution, built on centuries of medieval innovation. Others point out that Michelet's term glosses over the era's complexities, its political scheming, its brutal power struggles, even its darker moments of censorship and suppression. Yet the name endures, and it's easy to see why. Renaissance captures the drama of the period, the sense of rediscovery that fueled everything from Da Vinci's anatomical sketches to Copernicus's cosmic revelations. It's a word that carries weight, evoking golden sunlight on cathedral domes and the crisp pages of rediscovered Greek manuscripts. But behind that poetic label lies a messier truth, one where history is always written by those looking back, reshaping the past to fit the stories they want to tell. So the next time you hear Renaissance, remember, it's not just a name but a lens, coloring how we see everything from Michelangelo's chisel to Galileo's telescope. The devastation of the Black Death wasn't just a tragedy, it was an unexpected catalyst that reshaped Europe in ways no one could have predicted. When the plague swept across the continent in the 14th century, wiping out nearly half the population, it didn't just leave empty homes and abandoned villages. It tore apart the very fabric of medieval society, creating a vacuum that would eventually give rise to the Renaissance. Here's the irony: Amid the unimaginable suffering, the survivors found themselves in a world with new possibilities. With so many lives lost, labor became scarce, and suddenly, peasants and workers had something they'd never had before: leverage. For the first time, serfs could demand better wages, move freely to cities, and even challenge the rigid feudal system that had trapped their families for generations. This shift didn't just change economies, it changed minds. When people saw that old hierarchies could crumble, they started questioning everything: religion, authority, even the way they saw the world. And then there's the stark reality of loss. When death is everywhere, life becomes precious in a new way. Scholars who survived the plague turned to ancient texts, searching for wisdom that predated the chaos. Artists, no longer bound by the strict religious themes of the Middle Ages, began exploring human emotion, beauty, and individuality in their work. Even science took a leap forward. Doctors, desperate to understand the plague, began dissecting bodies, laying the groundwork for modern anatomy. But perhaps the most surprising twist: the plague didn't just create opportunity, it created urgency. With entire generations wiped out, those who remained knew time was fleeting. They poured their energy into discovery, artistry, and reinvention, as if making up for lost years in a single burst of creativity. So while we remember the Renaissance for its brilliance, it's worth asking, would the light have shone so brightly without the darkness that came before? The Black Death wasn't just a backdrop to the Renaissance, it was the fire that forged it. Florence should never have been the birthplace of the Renaissance, at least not by the usual rules of history. While Rome had the papacy and Venice had maritime wealth, Florence was just a modest city-state with no natural port or imperial legacy. Yet somehow, this unassuming wool-trading hub became the furnace where Renaissance creativity burned brightest. The secret: a perfect storm of money, ambition, and one family's obsession with leaving their mark on the world. At the heart of it all were the Medici, bankers who turned their gold into cultural dynamite. Unlike traditional nobles who hoarded wealth, they spent lavishly on art, architecture, and scholarship, not out of pure generosity, but as a calculated power play. In an era when influence was measured in frescoes and statues, funding Botticelli or Michelangelo was like buying social media clout today. But the Medici weren't just sponsors, they were matchmakers, connecting thinkers and artists in electrifying collaborations. When Cosimo de' Medici founded the Platonic Academy, he didn't just revive Greek philosophy, he created a petri dish where radical ideas could cross-pollinate. Yet even the Medici needed fertile ground, and Florence's economy was strangely suited for revolution. The city thrived on a contradiction: extreme wealth built by merchants, yet governed by republican ideals that, at least briefly, allowed talent to rise above bloodlines. Guilds of artisans held real political power, creating a rare environment where a goldsmith's son like Brunelleschi could design an architectural marvel like the Duomo's dome. Meanwhile, Florence's banking innovations, double-entry bookkeeping, letters of credit funded not just trade but the arts, turning financial tools into cultural rocket fuel. What made Florence truly unique, though, was its appetite for risk. While Venice played it safe with familiar Byzantine styles, Florentines competed to out-innovate each other, turning the city into a laboratory of the new. When Donatello sculpted his shockingly lifelike David, or Masaccio pioneered depth in painting, they weren't just making art. They were placing bets in a high-stakes game of one-upmanship. Every fresco became a manifesto, every bronze statue a challenge to the next genius. In that pressure cooker of rivalry and opportunity, the Renaissance didn't just emerge, it exploded. When we picture the Renaissance, we often imagine Italian scholars poring over ancient Greek texts, but those pages traveled a far stranger path than most realize. The truth is, Europe's rediscovery of classical philosophy and science wasn't a straightforward homecoming. It was a rescue mission, centuries in the making, carried out by Arabic-speaking scholars who saved these works from oblivion. While Western Europe was fragmented in the Middle Ages, the Islamic world became a beacon of intellectual preservation, meticulously translating and expanding on Greek knowledge that would have otherwise been lost. Take the story of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, a 9th-century intellectual powerhouse where teams of scholars translated Aristotle, Plato, and Hippocrates into Arabic, not just copying words but dissecting and debating them. By the time this knowledge trickled back to Europe via bustling trade hubs like Sicily and Andalusia, it had been enriched with Arabic commentaries and breakthroughs. The astronomy of Ptolemy filtered through the refinements of Persian polymath al-Battani, the medical theories of Galen, expanded by Ibn Sina, whose canon of medicine became Europe's medical textbook for 500 years. Even the Arabic numeral system we use today, with its revolutionary concept of zero, arrived as part of this cross-cultural exchange. The transfer happened in places like Toledo, Spain, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars worked side by side in the 12th century, translating Arabic texts into Latin. Picture a scribe hunched over a manuscript, rendering Ibn Rushd's critiques of Aristotle into a language that Thomas Aquinas would later study, igniting debates that reshaped European theology. Or consider Frederick Roman II, the Holy Roman Emperor who kept an Arabic-speaking court in Sicily, absorbing scientific ideas that would later fuel the Renaissance. Yet here's the irony: by the time these texts reached Italy, their Arabic origins were often scrubbed away, their journey erased to fit a narrative of European rediscovery. The Renaissance might have celebrated a return to pure antiquity, but its foundations were unmistakably global, a patchwork of ideas preserved by those history nearly forgot. So when you see Da Vinci's sketches echoing the optics of Alhazen, or hear Copernicus cite Arabic astronomers in his revolution, remember, the Renaissance didn't just rise from the ashes of Rome. It was pieced together, page by page, from the libraries of Baghdad, the observatories of Damascus, and the translation houses where East and West colluded to save knowledge from the dark. The Vatican's sprawling archives weren't just storing religious doctrine. They were sitting on a treasure trove of forgotten knowledge, locked away in chests and cloistered in remote monasteries across Europe. For centuries, these texts gathered dust, their wisdom fading into obscurity until a handful of daring humanists embarked on what can only be called intellectual treasure hunts. Among them, Poggio Bracciolini stood out, a book hunter with the instincts of a detective and the persistence of a prospector panning for gold. In the early 15th century, Poggio combed through monastic libraries, guided by rumors and fragments of information. Picture him riding from abbey to abbey, bribing gatekeepers and charming monks, all while searching for manuscripts that hadn't been seen in generations. His most startling discovery came in a Swiss monastery, where he stumbled upon a crumbling copy of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, a poem that laid out atomic theory centuries before modern science. The text had been copied and recopied by scribes who may not have fully grasped its revolutionary ideas, preserved by chance rather than intention. But here's the twist: the Church wasn't actively suppressing these works. Many had simply been forgotten, casualties of shifting priorities and limited literacy. Monasteries, often the only institutions preserving books, prioritized devotional texts over pagan philosophy. When humanists like Poggio began unearthing these lost gems, they didn't just recover old ideas, they ignited debates that would challenge medieval worldviews. Suddenly, scholars were reading Cicero's republicanism alongside Christian theology, or exploring Epicurean philosophy that contradicted church teachings on pleasure and virtue. The Vatican itself became a paradoxical player in this story. While some clerics viewed classical texts with suspicion, others, like Pope Nicholas V, became avid collectors, amassing a library that blended scripture with Aristotle and Plato. This wasn't just about hoarding knowledge, it was about controlling its flow. By deciding which manuscripts to copy, translate, or circulate, the Church shaped the Renaissance's intellectual landscape. Yet the most fascinating detail might be how fragile this transfer of knowledge was. Many works survived in just 1 or 2 copies, vulnerable to fire, mold, or simple neglect. If Poggio hadn't found that particular manuscript in that particular monastery, would we have ever known Lucretius's vision of the cosmos? The Renaissance wasn't just built on brilliance, it balanced on the razor's edge of luck, saved by book hunters who understood that every parchment was a thread connecting their present to antiquity's vanished grandeur. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press didn't just manufacture books, it minted revolutions on paper. While we often picture the Renaissance as a parade of elite thinkers and wealthy patrons, the real game changer was something far more democratic: the ability to mass-produce knowledge. Before Gutenberg's invention in the 1450s, books were painstakingly copied by hand, often taking months or even years to complete. A single Bible could cost as much as a house, locking scholarship behind gates of wealth and privilege. But when movable type hit the scene, it didn't just lower prices, it shattered the monopoly on learning. The press worked like intellectual wildfire, spreading ideas faster than anyone could control. Suddenly, ancient texts weren't just for monastery libraries or Medici palaces. A merchant in Antwerp could read Ovid. A farmer's son in Strasbourg might study Euclid's geometry. This wasn't just about quantity, it was about access, creating a marketplace of ideas where humanist philosophies, scientific theories, and even radical religious debates could circulate freely. Consider Erasmus, whose witty critiques of the Church became bestsellers, not because he had noble backing, but because the press let his words travel farther than any sermon. But here's what's often overlooked: the press didn't just spread Renaissance ideas, it transformed how people thought. Handwritten manuscripts were prone to errors, with scribes accidentally altering meanings over generations. Printed books standardized knowledge, allowing precise diagrams of anatomy or astronomy to be reproduced identically across Europe. When Copernicus argued the Earth revolved around the Sun, his diagrams reached thousands intact, fueling debates that handwritten copies might have muddled. Yet the press also had a shadow side. Authorities quickly realized its power, issuing the first censorship laws and index lists of forbidden books. Printers became fugitives, smuggling texts in bales of cloth or hollowed-out loaves of bread. And while literacy soared, it wasn't universal. Women and the poor still faced barriers. But the genie was out of the bottle. By the time Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517, they'd already been printed and distributed across Germany, proving the press didn't just support the Renaissance, it turned quiet whispers into roars that reshaped the world. The real genius of Gutenberg's invention, it made rebellion reproducible. Michelangelo and Leonardo weren't just artists, they were Renaissance-era rock stars, complete with fanfare, feuds, and scandals that would make tabloids blush. Imagine crowds parting as Michelangelo walked through Florence, his fame so immense that even popes tread carefully around his temper. When he unveiled the David, the city treated it like a blockbuster premiere, hauling the massive sculpture through the streets at night to avoid envious sabotage from rival cities. This wasn't just art, it was a spectacle, and the artists themselves became larger-than-life characters in a drama the whole world watched. Leonardo da Vinci took celebrity to another level, a genius so revered that kings fought over his attention. When he entered Milan, he didn't arrive with paintbrushes but with a silver lyre he'd crafted himself, performing music he'd composed to impress the court. His notebooks, filled with flying machines and cryptic musings, weren't just private sketches, they were props in his carefully curated image, designed to stun patrons into funding his next experiment. And let's not forget the whispers that he kept young male assistants for more than artistic help, or that his famous Salvator Mundi might be a clever forgery. The drama around his work still fuels debates today, proving some scandals never fade. But the real drama erupted when these stars collided. Florence became a battleground when Michelangelo and Leonardo were pitted against each other to paint rival murals in the same hall. Leonardo, the smooth-talking polymath, dismissed Michelangelo as a mere sculptor, while Michelangelo, the brooding perfectionist, mocked Leonardo for abandoning projects half-finished. Their feud wasn't just personal, it was ideological. Leonardo's delicate sfumato versus Michelangelo's muscular figures became a clash of worldviews, and the public ate it up like a soap opera. Even their patrons got swept into the theatrics. Pope Julius Roman II once stormed out of the Sistine Chapel, threatening to have Michelangelo thrown from the scaffolding when he complained about payment. Isabella d'Este, a powerhouse art collector, wrote furious letters when Leonardo kept her portrait commission languishing for years while he doodled inventions. These weren't just client relationships, they were high-stakes power plays where artists held their ground like modern-day influencers negotiating brand deals. What made them so audacious? Scarcity. In an era before photography or social media, witnessing a masterpiece in progress was a rare privilege. Every brushstroke was gossip fodder, every unfinished work a cliffhanger. And unlike today's celebrities, these artists didn't just create, they built mythologies around themselves, crafting personas as meticulously as their art. Michelangelo signed his name across the Virgin Mary's sash in the Piet, like a rapper dropping a diss track, ensuring no one forgot who shaped the marble. Meanwhile, Leonardo left behind coded notebooks and backward handwriting, teasing future generations with puzzles he knew they'd obsess over. The takeaway. The Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth of art, it was the birth of celebrity culture where talent, ego, and publicity collided to create legends we're still unpacking centuries later. These men weren't just painters or sculptors, they were the first to prove that genius could be as magnetic as any crown. History remembers the Renaissance as a parade of male geniuses, but what if we've been missing half the picture? Behind the towering reputations of Michelangelo and Raphael, women like Sophonisba Anguissola were quietly rewriting the rules of art, only to have their stories erased by centuries of patriarchal bias. Anguissola wasn't just talented, she was revolutionary, a painter so skilled she caught the eye of Spain's King Philip Roman II, who summoned her to court as both artist and tutor to the Queen. Her portraits broke conventions by capturing subjects mid-laugh or in candid moments, a radical departure from the stiff formality of her male contemporaries. Yet for all her brilliance, later historians often dismissed her as a student of male masters, a narrative that conveniently ignored how Michelangelo himself admired her work and exchanged sketches with her. The erasure wasn't accidental. Renaissance society funneled women into rigid roles, wives, nuns, or silent muses, while denying them access to the apprenticeships and life drawing classes that male artists took for granted. Take Lavinia Fontana, who painted biblical scenes with female protagonists so vivid they seemed to step off the canvas. She managed a thriving studio in Bologna, a rare feat for a woman, yet art history relegated her to footnotes until recently. Or Artemisia Gentileschi, whose brutal depiction of Judith slaying Holofernes isn't just art. It's a visceral response to her own rape trial, a subject no male artist of the era dared to tackle. The most insidious part, many of these women's works were literally painted over or attributed to men. Plautilla Nelli, a self-taught nun in Florence, created monumental religious canvases that later collectors improved by having male artists add finishing touches, as if her brushwork needed validation. Even when their signatures survived, scholars assumed they were wives or daughters signing for a male relative. It wasn't until the 21st century that technology like infrared imaging began uncovering the truth, revealing underdrawings and techniques unique to these female hands. Yet their influence seeped through in subtle ways. Anguissola's relaxed, intimate style quietly shaped the next generation of portraitists, while Fontana's depictions of intellectual women, books in hand, gazes direct challenged stereotypes. Today's rediscovery of these artists isn't just about fairness, it's about correcting our very understanding of the Renaissance. because when we ignore half its creators, we're not just missing great art, we're seeing only a shadow of the revolution that changed the world. Copernicus didn't just move the earth, he shook the foundations of reality as Europe knew it. In 1543, on his deathbed, the Polish astronomer finally published his bombshell theory. The sun, not the earth, was the center of the cosmos. It was an idea so radical that even he hesitated for decades, knowing it would upend not just science but the very theology that governed daily life. The Church had built its worldview on ancient Greek astronomy, blending Ptolemy's earth-centered model with biblical passages like Joshua commanding the sun to stand still. To suggest otherwise wasn't just incorrect, it was heresy, a threat to the divine order itself. Yet Copernicus wasn't operating in a vacuum. Cracks in the old system had been widening for years. Astronomers struggled to explain quirks in planetary motion using Ptolemy's complicated system of epicycles, those celestial loop-the-loops planets supposedly traced around Earth. When Copernicus crunched the numbers, placing the sun at the center cleaned up the math beautifully, but elegance wasn't enough to sway tradition. His supporters circulated his ideas cautiously, framing them as mere mathematical tools rather than physical truth. Even his landmark book, On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, included a foreword possibly added without his consent, calling it a hypothetical exercise. The Church's reaction wasn't immediate fury but slow-burning alarm. At first, Copernican theory spread in academic circles, debated like a provocative thought experiment. But by Galileo's time decades later, the stakes had skyrocketed. When the Italian turned his telescope to the heavens, discovering moons orbiting Jupiter and imperfections on the sun, he didn't just gather data, he handed ammunition to a revolution. His public advocacy for Copernicus forced the Church's hand, leading to his infamous trial in 1633. Forced to recant, he supposedly muttered under his breath, "And yet it moves." What's often missed is how this clash reshaped both sides. The Church's resistance wasn't monolithic. Many Jesuit astronomers quietly used Copernican math for navigation while publicly towing the doctrinal line. Even the Index of Forbidden Books, which banned Copernicus's work until revisions were made, couldn't stop the tide. Protestant regions free from Vatican censors became hotbeds of heliocentric debate. Meanwhile, scientists learned to speak in code. Johannes Kepler couched his planetary laws in mystical numerology, and Tycho Brahe proposed a hybrid model to dodge controversy. The real legacy of this struggle wasn't just a corrected star chart. It marked the first crack in the idea that truth could be dictated by authority, seeding a skepticism that would blossom into the scientific revolution. Copernicus's heliocentrism did more than reposition planets, it redefined humanity's place in the universe, proving that sometimes to see clearly, you must first dare to shift your vantage point. The Borgias didn't just play the game of power, they rewrote the rules with a blend of artistry and brutality that still shocks us today. At first glance, Pope Alexander VI and his children might seem like typical Renaissance patrons, commissioning lavish frescoes and supporting artists like Pinturicchio. But look closer and you'll find a darker masterpiece, a web of alliances, assassinations, and propaganda painted not on canvas, but across the heart of Italy itself. Their story isn't just about corruption, it's about how beauty and terror could be wielded as twin weapons in the quest for control. Take the Vatican apartments, where Pinturicchio's glittering murals depicted the Borgias as divinely chosen rulers. Behind the gold leaf and biblical scenes lay a cunning message. These weren't just decorations but visual manifestos. One fresco showed Alexander VI kneeling before a triumphant Christ, subtly equating the Pope's authority with celestial mandate. Meanwhile, his daughter Lucrezia's portrait as a saintly figure hid her real role, a political pawn married off 3 times to secure alliances. The Borgias understood something revolutionary. Art could sanctify even the most scandalous deeds, turning whispers of murder into whispers of divine favor. Their tactics went beyond imagery. When the family needed to silence enemies, they didn't just hire assassins, they engineered spectacles. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's ruthless son, once hosted a banquet where his soldiers strangled two rival nobles mid-feast, their bodies left slumped over the table as dessert was served. This wasn't mere violence, it was theater designed to spread fear through storytelling. Even Machiavelli took notes, later citing Cesare as the ideal prince, a ruler who blended charm and cruelty so seamlessly that no one dared cross him twice. The darkest twist, the Borgias weaponized the church itself. Alexander VI turned holy offices into bargaining chips, selling cardinal positions to fund his wars. He even staged a mock crucifixion in the Vatican gardens, hiring a monk to impersonate Christ while the family watched, a stunt that blurred sacrilege and spectacle so completely it left contemporaries aghast. Yet for all their infamy, the Borgias also fueled creativity. Their patronage bankrolled artists, architects, and even the first recorded bullfight in Rome, proving how easily decadence could masquerade as cultural progress. What makes their legacy so chilling isn't just their deeds, but their brilliance in masking them. They built universities while poisoning rivals, hosted poets while plotting coups, and left behind a paradox, a family so vile they became synonymous with evil, yet so inventive they helped shape the Renaissance's glittering surface. Their true masterpiece wasn't any painting or palace, it was the blueprint they left for how power, when draped in enough gold, can make even history look the other way. Botticelli's Primavera might look like a simple celebration of spring, but crack the surface, and you'll find a visual manifesto of forbidden ideas smuggled into paint by one of Florence's most enigmatic minds. At first glance, the scene is pure poetry. Venus presiding over a grove where the three graces dance and Flora scatters flowers. But every figure, every gesture is a carefully placed clue, pointing to a dangerous fascination with ancient pagan mysticism that could have gotten Botticelli exiled, or worse. The Medicis and their inner circle were obsessed with Neoplatonism, a philosophy blending Christian thought with Greek mystery cults, and Botticelli became their visual storyteller. Take Zephyrus, the wind god clutching the nymph Chloris in the painting's right corner. To Renaissance churchgoers, this might seem like harmless mythology. But for initiates of Florence's secret philosophical circles, it symbolized the soul's journey, Zephyrus representing raw desire, transforming into spiritual love as Chloris morphs into Flora. Even Venus's gesture, hand raised as if in blessing, mirrors Neoplatonic diagrams of divine emanation, where higher realms pour wisdom into the material world. These weren't just artistic choices, they were dog whistles to a select few who could read the code. The birth of Venus doubles down on the heresy. The goddess rising from the waves isn't just a myth, she's an allegory for the human soul's divine origin. A direct challenge to church doctrine that claimed salvation came only through Christ. The winds blowing her ashore echo Neoplatonic texts describing divine love as a cosmic force, while the Hora offering a cloak resembles ancient initiation rituals. Most daring of all, Botticelli modeled Venus after Simonetta Vespucci, a married noblewoman and Medici muse, turning a real woman into a pagan icon under the Vatican's nose. What saved Botticelli from the Inquisition was patronage. The Medicis, particularly Lorenzo de' Medici, protected artists exploring these ideas, funding a cultural revolution beneath the church's radar. But when firebrand preacher Savonarola rose to power, condemning pagan art as sinful, Botticelli reportedly threw some of his own paintings onto the bonfire of the vanities. Whether this was fear, repentance, or survival instinct remains one of art history's great mysteries. The real genius of these paintings lies in their duality. They delighted the masses with beauty while whispering secrets to those who knew how to listen. Today, we admire them as masterpieces, but in their time they were something far riskier, a visual rebellion, proof that even in an age of dogma, artists could hide revolutions in plain sight. While Europe's Renaissance dazzles in history books, another cultural revival was unfolding simultaneously, one fueled by African scholarship and innovation, yet often erased from the narrative. Far from being passive bystanders, Ethiopian and Moorish thinkers were shaping Renaissance ideas through diplomacy, trade, and sheer intellectual firepower. Take the Ethiopian delegation that arrived in Florence in 1441. Sent by Emperor Zara Yacob to forge ties with the Medicis. These weren't just diplomats, they carried texts like the Kebra Nagast, an epic linking Ethiopia's rulers to King Solomon, challenging European assumptions about Africa's place in sacred history. Their presence sparked fascination. Pope Pius Roman II even wrote a treatise on Africa inspired by their exchanges, yet their influence faded from mainstream accounts. Moorish Spain acted as Europe's silent tutor long before the Renaissance bloomed. Cities like Toledo and Cordoba became bustling marketplaces of ideas where Jewish, Muslim, and Christian scholars collaborated. The Toledo school of translators didn't just preserve Greek philosophy, they refined it with figures like Gerard of Cremona rendering Arabic commentaries on Aristotle into Latin. Ever used the word algebra? Thank Al-Khwarizmi, whose 9th century works traveled from Baghdad to Italian universities via these networks. Even the astrolabe, that quintessential Renaissance navigational tool, was perfected by Moorish craftsmen before landing in the hands of European explorers. The exclusion wasn't accidental. As European powers expanded, so did the need to frame the Renaissance as a purely European miracle. Ethiopian frescoes depicting biblical scenes with black saints were labeled primitive, while the mathematical breakthroughs of Al-Andalus were recast as European discoveries. The irony, some of the very technologies that powered Europe's age of exploration, improved cartography, maritime compasses, owed debts to African and Islamic innovators. Rediscovering these connections does more than correct the record. It reveals the Renaissance as a tapestry woven from threads stretching across continents. When Venetian artists painted the Magi as African kings, or when Copernicus cited the astronomical tables of Albertoni, they acknowledged this global dialogue, one that history for too long chose to forget. Leonardo da Vinci left behind over 7,000 pages of notes, a treasure trove of ideas so ahead of their time they might as well have been messages from the future. Flying machines, diving suits, even rudimentary robots, all meticulously sketched in his mirror-writing scroll. Yet for nearly 200 years after his death in 1519, these notebooks gathered dust in attics and forgotten storerooms, dismissed as the ramblings of a painter who dabbled in eccentric hobbies. The tragedy isn't just that his genius went unrecognized, it's that Europe lost a head start on the scientific revolution because no one could decipher the mind behind the madness. The fate of his manuscripts reads like a thriller. Some were pawned off by heirs who saw them as junk. Others were scattered across Europe, tucked into private collections where they languished unread. A few even got repurposed. One notebook's pages were famously cut up and used to line a chest of drawers. The irony is brutal. The man who obsessed over preserving knowledge had his life's work treated like scrap paper. Why did it take so long for the world to catch up? Part of the problem was Leonardo himself. His mirrored handwriting, meant to keep ideas secret, became a barrier. Without his guiding hand, few had the patience to decode pages where every word was backward. Even more daunting was the sheer breadth of his interests: anatomy mixed with hydraulics, optics jumbled beside stage designs. To Renaissance scholars trained in rigid disciplines, his notebooks seemed chaotic, lacking the orderly structure of traditional academic texts, but the real roadblock was mindset. Leonardo thought in connections, seeing how a bird's wing could inspire a flying machine or how water vortices might explain heart valves. His contemporaries, though, were still wedded to Aristotelian categories that separated art from science. When Galileo and Newton later pioneered physics, they did so without ever seeing Leonardo's notes on momentum and gravity, ideas that might have accelerated their work by generations. The turning point finally came in the late 18th century when Napoleon's troops looted a trove of manuscripts from Italy. Among them was the Codex Leicester, filled with Leonardo's studies of geology and light. Suddenly, scholars realized these weren't doodles but breakthroughs. His prediction that mountains were formed by shifting tectonic plates predated modern geology by 300 years. His designs for parabolic mirrors foreshadowed solar power. Even his anatomical sketches, dismissed as macabre in his lifetime, proved startlingly accurate once medicine advanced enough to verify them. Today, we celebrate these notebooks as visionary, but their centuries in obscurity reveal a sobering truth. Genius means nothing if the world isn't ready to see it. Leonardo's real legacy isn't just the inventions he dreamed up, it's the warning he left about how easily brilliance can be lost to short-sightedness. His pages whisper a question we're still grappling with. How many other Leonardos are out there, their ideas waiting in drawers for the future to finally catch up? For centuries, sacred music had dominated Europe's soundscape, Gregorian chants echoing through vaulted cathedrals, their solemn melodies designed to lift the soul toward heaven. But by the 15th century, something unexpected happened. Music began stepping out of the church and into the courts, trading holy reverence for human passion. This was the birth of secular polyphony, where intricate harmonies once reserved for praising God now celebrated earthly love, political triumphs, and even the occasional scandal. The shift wasn't just about entertainment, it was a quiet rebellion, a sign that Europe's cultural priorities were turning inward, toward the beauty and complexity of human experience. Take Guillaume Dufay, a composer who bridged both worlds. His early masses followed strict liturgical traditions, but when he penned "See la face I pale," a chanson about unrequited love, he used the same polyphonic techniques that had once glorified the divine. The effect was revolutionary, voices intertwined not in worship but in storytelling, mimicking the tension and release of human emotion. Noble courts ate it up. Suddenly, music wasn't just a path to salvation, it was a status symbol, proof of a patron's sophistication. The Duke of Burgundy famously kept an ensemble of singers rivaling the popes, not to chant psalms, but to serenade guests with tales of chivalry and heartbreak. The lyrics themselves tell a fascinating story. Sacred music had stuck to Latin, the language of scripture and scholarship, but secular polyphony embraced vernacular tongues, French, Italian, Occitan, letting composers play with double entendres and local humor. In Josquin des Prez's El Grillo, a frothy ditty about a cricket, the music mimics the insect's chirps with playful precision. It's a far cry from the solemnity of a requiem, yet it demanded the same technical mastery, proving irreverence could be as artful as devotion. Behind this shift lurked bigger forces. As city-states grew wealthier, a new merchant class craved cultural legitimacy, commissioning songs that reflected their lives rather than ecclesiastical dogma. Printing presses made sheet music more accessible, spreading secular tunes beyond elite circles. Even the church took notice. Some clerics condemned the trend as decadent, while others secretly enjoyed the catchy melodies creeping into their choirs. By the time the madrigal era bloomed in the 16th century, with composers like Monteverdi setting steamy poetry to lush harmonies, the line between sacred and profane had blurred beyond repair. What made this revolution so enduring was its humanity. Sacred music aimed for the eternal, but secular polyphony thrived on the here and now, the flush of a first kiss, the sting of betrayal, the glee of a feast. It was music that laughed, sighed, and whispered secrets, proving that even in an age of celestial aspirations, the human heart could be the most compelling muse of all. Alchemy wasn't just medieval mysticism, it was the wild, dangerous laboratory where modern chemistry took its first unsteady steps. Behind the cryptic symbols and quest for the philosopher's stone, Renaissance alchemists like Paracelsus were conducting experiments that would revolutionize medicine, metallurgy, and even psychology. Picture a dim workshop filled with bubbling flasks and stained manuscripts, where every failed attempt to turn lead into gold accidentally uncovered truths about the natural world. These weren't just dreamers, they were the original mad scientists, blending rigorous observation with spiritual obsession in a way that defies modern categories. Paracelsus, the bombastic Swiss-German alchemist who tossed medical textbooks into bonfires, embodied this contradiction. While he searched for the prima materia, the mythical substance that could heal all diseases, he also pioneered the use of minerals like mercury and sulfur in medicine. His audacious claim that illness stemmed from chemical imbalances, not divine wrath, upended centuries of medical dogma. When he dosed syphilis patients with carefully measured mercury compounds, he wasn't just practicing proto-chemistry. He was risking heresy charges by implying the body operated by material, not mystical rules. The tools of alchemy tell their own story. The athana, a slow-burning furnace designed to mimic the heat of the sun, became the ancestor of today's lab burners. Distillation apparatuses created to purify quintessence eventually produced everything from perfume to whiskey. Even the alchemist's meticulous record-keeping, encoded in symbols to protect secrets, set a precedent for scientific documentation. The irony: their quest for transmutation led to practical discoveries, alchemists isolating phosphorus by boiling down gallons of urine, or stumbling upon porcelain recipes while trying to imitate Chinese ceramics. Yet the philosopher's stone wasn't just about greed or immortality. For many alchemists, it symbolized spiritual enlightenment, the transformation of base human nature into something higher. This dual pursuit of physical and metaphysical truth created a bridge between medieval scholasticism and empirical science. When Robert Boyle, often called the father of modern chemistry, began his experiments in the 17th century, he did so surrounded by alchemical texts, carefully separating their practical methods from their mystical goals. The real legacy of alchemy lies in its mindset, the relentless curiosity that turned failure into discovery. Every explosion in an alchemist's workshop, every toxic vapor inhaled, was a step toward understanding matter's hidden laws. What we now call the scientific method emerged from this messy, dangerous dance between ambition and accident, proof that even the wildest dreams can leave behind something solid, something real. The alchemists never found their stone, but they handed us something far more valuable: the tools to unlock nature's true secrets. Clothing in the Renaissance wasn't just fabric, it was a battlefield where social status, politics, and personal identity collided in vibrant color. Gone were the loose tunics and undyed wools of the Middle Ages. In their place, a revolution of silhouette and hue announced a new era of self-expression. Tailors became alchemists, transforming cloth into power suits with padded shoulders, cinched waists, and slashed sleeves, revealing flashes of expensive lining beneath. These weren't just outfits, they were wearable manifestos declaring that the individual mattered as much as the institution, the secret weapon, color. While peasants still wore earthy tones, elites flaunted garments dyed with rare pigments like Tyrian purple from crushed sea snails or vivid vermilion made from toxic mercury sulfide. A single gown might cost more than a peasant's yearly earnings, its hues broadcasting wealth louder than any herald. But the real game changer was tailoring. Suddenly, clothing hugged the body, accentuating masculine broadness or feminine curves in ways medieval sack-like garments never dared. Portraits from the period show this shift vividly. Where medieval figures faded into their robes, Renaissance subjects occupied their clothes, their postures and fabrics working together to project confidence and personality. Yet freedom had limits. Sumptuary laws detailed regulations dictating who could wear what, revealed the panic beneath the glamour. In Venice, prostitutes were ordered to wear yellow scarves so men wouldn't mistake them for respectable women. In England, only royalty could sport ermine fur, while merchants caught wearing silk faced hefty fines. These laws weren't just about fashion policing. They were desperate attempts to maintain a social order unraveling as fast as new dyes could stain fabric. The most fascinating twist, how often these rules were ignored. Diaries and court records overflow with creative loopholes, middle-class women stitching forbidden gold thread onto the inside of sleeves, or bankers' wives wearing modest wool gowns lined with illegal silk. Even armor got in on the act, with knights commissioning elaborate parade suits etched with mythological scenes, turning martial gear into walking art galleries. This sartorial revolution's legacy stretches further than you might think. Those slashed sleeves, originally a soldier's hack after battles, they'd stuff their torn uniforms with colorful scrap fabric to stay warm, accidentally launching a trend that swept courts. And those stiff ruffs around noble necks, they began as simple linen bands to protect expensive collars from sweat, then spiraled into ever larger statements of impracticality. Every stitch and hue whispered the same radical idea, that what you wore could tell the world not just who you were, but who you aspired to be, a notion that still drives fashion today. Venetian glassmakers didn't just craft delicate goblets, they held a monopoly so tight it bordered on espionage. The island of Murano, where these artisans were confined by law, became a fortress of secrets, its workshops producing not just luxury items but the very tools that would sharpen humanity's vision of the world. The most coveted innovation, Cristallo, a flawless, colorless glass so transparent it resembled crystal, a breakthrough that transformed everything from scientific instruments to the vanity mirrors of Europe's elites. But Venice didn't achieve this dominance through skill alone. They enforced their supremacy with draconian measures, glassmakers forbidden from leaving the Republic under penalty of death, their families held hostage to ensure loyalty. This wasn't just industry, it was a high-stakes game of intellectual property theft where a single defector could topple an empire. The ripple effects were profound. Without Venetian glass, Galileo might never have crafted the telescope that upended astronomy. His lenses relied on Murano's flawless silica, ground to precision by artisans who understood light's behavior intuitively, centuries before optics became formal science. Mirror production, another Venetian specialty, changed art forever suddenly. Painters like Van Eyck could study reflections with eerie accuracy, capturing light and shadow in ways that made medieval art seem flat by comparison. Even the humble hourglass, essential for navigation, depended on Murano's uniformly sized sand grains, a testament to their mastery of material science. Yet the most fascinating twist wasn't the secrecy, it was how often it failed. Despite the threats, craftsmen smuggled knowledge beyond Venetian borders. In 1673, King Louis Roman XIV lured Murano workers to France with promises of asylum and gold, leading to the birth of Saint Gobain, Europe's rival glass empire. Earlier in the 1500s, a group of defectors reportedly escaped to Germany, taking Cristallo recipes with them. Venice's response, sending assassins disguised as merchants to silence the traitors, a real-life thriller played out in shadowed workshops and foggy canals. What made Murano's glass so irreplaceable wasn't just chemistry, it was centuries of accumulated craft passed down like oral poetry. The exact mix of Levantine soda ash and local quartz sand, the precise temperature of the furnaces, even the way artisans blew molten glass into perfect spheres, all were nuances no written formula could fully capture. Modern scientists still marvel at Renaissance Venetian glass's durability. Some pieces remain flawless after 500 years, while contemporary versions degrade in decades. The real legacy of this monopoly, a paradox, Venice's ruthless control stifled innovation elsewhere, yet by perfecting their craft to such extremes, they inadvertently laid the groundwork for breakthroughs far beyond art. Those crystal-clear lenses didn't just decorate palaces, they focused humanity's gaze outward, toward stars and cells alike, proving that sometimes progress begins not with sharing, but with guarding a secret until the world is ready to steal it. Between 1585 and 1592, William Shakespeare vanishes from history, no records, no poems, not even a scrap of handwriting to confirm where the most famous playwright in history spent 7 formative years. This gap, known as the lost years, has fueled speculation for centuries, but one tantalizing theory suggests he might have wandered Italy, absorbing the sights, scandals, and stories that would later seep into his plays. If true, it would mean the Renaissance didn't just inspire Shakespeare, it might have shaped him in ways we're only beginning to unravel. Consider the geographic precision in his Italian set works. The Merchant of Venice describes the Rialto Bridge and Venetian customs with uncanny accuracy for someone who supposedly never left England. Romeo and Juliet nails Verona's feuding families and even references specific neighborhoods. Then there's The Taming of the Shrew, set in Padua, where Shakespeare names real vineyards and landmarks. Coincidence, maybe, but when you pair it with a cryptic 16th century document listing an Shakespeare among English actors touring northern Italy, the plot thickens. The cultural parallels are even more striking. Italian Renaissance comedies, with their mistaken identities and witty servants, mirror the bard's early farces. The tragic intensity of Othello echoes the bloody revenge dramas of Italian playwrights like Cinthio, whose work hadn't yet been translated to English. Even Hamlet's existential musings feel closer to the philosophical debates of Florentine humanists than the straightforward morality plays of Elizabethan theatre. Yet the skeptics raise valid points. Shakespeare's education didn't include Italian, and no definitive proof places him abroad. But here's the twist: he wouldn't have needed fluency. English merchants and actors frequented Italian cities, and a curious wordsmith could have picked up enough local color through gestures, sketches, or translated conversations. As for records, many were lost in fires, floods, or the chaos of the Reformation. The most compelling clue might be the plays themselves. When Shakespeare describes a gondola's movements in The Two Gentlemen of Verona, he doesn't just call it a boat. He notes how it whisks through canals, a detail only someone who'd witnessed Venice's unique waterways might capture. Or take the apothecary's shop in Romeo and Juliet, stocked with jars of dried specimens eerily similar to those in Italian pharmacies of the era. These aren't textbook descriptions, they're sensory memories, the kind etched by experience rather than research. Whether Shakespeare actually trod Italian cobblestones or simply absorbed second-hand tales, one thing's certain: his lost years left an indelible mark. The Renaissance's shadow stretches across his work, from the architecture of his plots to the very themes: individual ambition, the clash of fate and free will, that made the era so revolutionary. Perhaps the real mystery isn't where he went, but how deeply a single mind could channel the spirit of an age, turning whispers of distant cities into stories that still pulse with life 4 centuries later. Christopher Marlowe didn't just write plays, he lived them, weaving a double life so audacious it blurred the line between playwright and spy. While his name is etched in literary history as Shakespeare's radical contemporary, few realize his ink-stained fingers also penned coded messages for Queen Elizabeth's Secret Service. The same man who wrote Dr. Faustus, a drama about selling one's soul for knowledge, might have traded his own talents to England's shadowy network of intelligencers. His sudden, violent death in a tavern brawl at 29 wasn't just a tragic end. It reeks of espionage, dirty fingerprints, a mystery still hotly debated by historians today. The Elizabethan era thrived on subterfuge, with artists and diplomats serving as perfect covers for intelligence work. Marlowe's education at Cambridge raised eyebrows when the Privy Council intervened to grant him a degree despite erratic attendance, an unusual favor suggesting he'd been abroad on Her Majesty's business. His fluency in French and Latin made him ideal for continental missions, possibly infiltrating Catholic circles plotting against Protestant England. Even his plays dripped with insider knowledge. The Massacre at Paris dramatized recent French political murders with unsettling accuracy, as if written by someone who'd walked those blood-stained streets. But Marlowe wasn't alone in this shadow game. Diplomat poets like Sir Walter Raleigh moved in the same circles, using poetry as both social camouflage and propaganda. A sonnet praising the Queen could flatter while subtly signaling alliances. A satirical verse might discredit enemies without direct accusation. Even the theaters themselves became hubs of intelligence gathering, crowded, anonymous spaces where foreign agents could be observed, and where plays like Marlowe's The Jew of Malta, with its themes of betrayal and deception, might have been designed to stir anti-Spanish sentiment. The most tantalizing clue lies in Marlowe's association with Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster extraordinaire. Walsingham's network included cryptographers, forgers, and even a school for training young agents in the art of politic deceit. Marlowe's roommate, Thomas Kidd, later claimed under torture that they'd both penned atheistic writings, a charge often used to smear political dissidents. When Marlowe was stabbed above the eye in that Deptford tavern, the three men present were all connected to intelligence work, and the official inquest smelled suspiciously like a cover-up. What makes this nexus of art and espionage so compelling isn't just the personal drama, it's how cultural production became a weapon in the Cold Wars of the Renaissance. Marlowe's plays, with their subversive themes of power and ambition, didn't just entertain, they shaped public opinion in ways that served state interests. His unfinished epic, Hero and Leander, published posthumously, even contains passages that read like veiled critiques of Elizabeth's court. Whether he was a patriot, a double agent, or simply a brilliant writer caught in the crossfire, Marlowe's story exposes the Renaissance's darkest truth. Brilliance often flourished in the service of secrets, and sometimes the quill was mightier than the dagger, but just as deadly. Rome in 1527 should have been the crown jewel of the Renaissance. Instead, it became a charnel house. As imperial troops sacked the city, a deadlier invader slipped through the chaos, bubonic plague. Within months, the streets that had buzzed with artistic fervor lay littered with bodies, their stench so overpowering that even looters fled. This wasn't just another outbreak, it was a pivot point, a moment when the Renaissance's celebration of human potential collided brutally with the fragility of life. Artists who'd once painted Madonnas with serene grace now turned their brushes toward darker visions, skulls hidden in still lifes, hourglasses tucked into portraits, dance macabre motifs creeping into frescoes like shadows at dusk. Take Parmigianino's Madonna with the long neck, painted just years after the plague. At first glance, it's pure Renaissance elegance, until you notice the unsettling proportions, the eerie elongation of limbs, the prophet Jeremiah holding a scroll that seems to crumble at the edges. These weren't stylistic choices, they were subconscious tremors from an artist living in a world where beauty and decay shared the same breath. Even Raphael's workshop, once the epicenter of classical harmony, began producing works like The Plague at Phrygia, where angels wield swords against pestilence rather than strumming lyres. The plague's psychological toll ran deeper than imagery. Before 1527, artists like Michelangelo could demand princely sums and leisurely deadlines. Afterward, patrons died or vanished, workshops shuttered, and surviving masters scrambled for commissions, often taking on macabre themes they'd once avoided. Titian's Pietà, intended for his own tomb, throbs with raw grief, its twisted figures and stormy palette a far cry from his earlier vibrant mythologies. The change wasn't just personal, it reflected a Europe-wide shift toward memento mori art, where even lavish portraits included subtle reminders of death's inevitability. Yet from this darkness emerged unexpected innovations. Medical illustrators, desperate to document symptoms, created shockingly accurate anatomical studies that would later influence Vesalius. Funeral monuments became elaborate theatrical displays, blending sculpture and architecture in ways that prefigured Baroque drama. And in Florence, the plague's aftermath birthed the first quarantine hospitals, sterile, symmetrical buildings that married public health with Renaissance ideals of order and proportion. The forgotten plague of 1527 didn't just add grim flourishes to art. It forced a generation to reconcile humanism's bright promise with life's brutal uncertainties. The result, a Renaissance that grew wiser, wearier, and infinitely more layered, where every golden sunset now cast long, knowing shadows. Galileo's telescope didn't just reveal the moons of Jupiter. It exposed a fault line between faith and reason that would force one of history's greatest minds into a tortuous dance of defiance and self-preservation. While we remember his trial and recantation, the deeper tragedy lies in the years of stifled ideas, the discoveries he hinted at but never published, the letters he burned or encrypted to avoid the Inquisition's gaze. This wasn't just persecution, it was a chilling effect that bent the arc of scientific progress, leaving generations of thinkers to measure their words like heretics stepping on thin ice. Consider his treatise on tides, written as the Church tightened its grip. Instead of attributing oceanic movements to Earth's motion, a direct challenge to Scripture, Galileo framed it as a mere hypothesis, couching revolutionary science in medieval terminology to placate censors. When he did publish his landmark dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, he buried Copernican arguments in fictional debates, hoping the veneer of fiction would shield him. It didn't. The Vatican's fury wasn't just about astronomy, it was about control. By forcing Galileo to kneel, they sent a message: even genius must bow to dogma. The ripple effects were profound. Young scholars watched his humiliation and chose caution over curiosity. The Jesuit astronomer Giovanni Riccioli, though privately convinced of heliocentrism, publicly rejected it in his 1651 treatise, not out of conviction but survival. Correspondence between scientists slowed, filled with coded phrases and third-hand accounts to obscure controversial ideas. Even the printing trade adapted, with Venetian publishers developing a niche for hypothetical works that teased radical theories while maintaining plausible deniability. Yet the Inquisition's shadow had cracks. Some clerics, like the Benedictine scholar Benedetto Caselli, secretly taught Galileo's ideas in hushed classrooms. Wealthy patrons commissioned private telescopes, creating a black market for forbidden knowledge. And in Protestant strongholds like England, where censorship loosened, thinkers like Robert Hooke built openly on Galileo's suppressed work. The irony: by trying to silence one man, the Church inadvertently turned his ideas into contraband, making them more tantalizing, more discussed in whispers than they might have been in open debate. The real cost wasn't just in delayed discoveries, but in the paths not taken. How many Galileos chose silence over scrutiny? How many manuscripts molded in drawers, their authors fearing the stake more than obscurity? The Renaissance had unlocked human potential, but the Inquisition taught a harrowing lesson. Knowledge could be as dangerous as it was divine. Galileo's story isn't just about a clash between science and religion. It's a warning of what happens when fear governs thought, and how easily the light of inquiry can be dimmed by the shadow of a raised cross. When Ottoman cannons breached the walls of Constantinople in 1453, they didn't just topple an empire, they shattered the last great vault of classical knowledge. As Turkish soldiers poured into the city, Byzantine scholars scrambled to save what they could, stuffing saddlebags with crumbling manuscripts and fleeing west by any means possible. These weren't just books, they were irreplaceable treasures: original works by Plato and Aristotle, scientific treatises by Archimedes, and mathematical texts by Euclid, all preserved for centuries in Constantinople's labyrinthine libraries while Europe had forgotten their very existence. The scholars who carried them to Italy became unwitting midwives of the Renaissance, sparking a fever for Greek learning that would redefine Western thought. One such refugee, the philosopher Gemistos Platon, arrived in Florence with a battered trunk full of Plato's dialogues, texts so rare most Italians knew them only through fragmented Latin translations. His lectures electrified Cosimo de' Medici, who promptly founded the Platonic Academy to revive these ancient ideas. Suddenly, Florentine artists and thinkers were grappling with concepts like Platonic ideals, which would later inspire Botticelli's ethereal figures and Michelangelo's pursuit of perfect form. The mathematician Regiomontanus, studying newly recovered Greek geometry, developed trigonometry that would guide Columbus across the Atlantic. Even the political theories of Cicero, rediscovered in Constantinople's ashes, fueled Machiavelli's ruthless pragmatism in The Prince. The transfer wasn't always dignified. Some manuscripts were sold piecemeal to Venetian merchants, their pages scattered across Europe. Others arrived waterlogged from harrowing sea escapes, like Cardinal Bessarion's collection, salvaged from a sinking ship off Crete. A few precious codices had even been smuggled out centuries earlier during the Crusades, hidden in wine barrels or sewn into the linings of pilgrims' robes, proof that knowledge once lost could resurface in the unlikeliest ways. What made this exodus transformative wasn't just the texts themselves, but how they were read. Byzantine scholars didn't merely preserve Greek works. They'd spent generations annotating them, debating them, layering them with commentaries that enriched the originals. When these annotated volumes reached Italy, they didn't just provide answers, they sparked new questions, turning humanism from a nostalgic revival into a living, breathing intellectual revolution. The fall of Constantinople was a tragedy for Byzantium, but for Europe it became an unexpected gift, the chance to reclaim a past it never knew it had lost, and in doing so, invent a new future. Long before the Renaissance painted its masterpieces or sculpted its ideals, Dante Alighieri was already mapping the contours of a revolution in his Divine Comedy. Written in the early 1400s, this epic journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise didn't just entertain, it planted the seeds of humanism a full century before the Medici made it fashionable. At first glance, the poem seems medieval, packed with theological symbolism and cosmic hierarchies, but peel back the layers and you'll find something radical, a work that places human reason and emotion at the center of salvation, where even the damned get to tell their stories with wrenching intimacy. Take the very structure of the comedy. Unlike earlier religious texts that presented divine truth as absolute and unchallengeable, Dante's hell is a place of dialogue and debate. When he meets Francesca da Rimini in the Circle of the Lustful, her tale of forbidden love isn't just a cautionary example, it's a heartbreaking monologue that forces readers to grapple with moral complexity. The poet Statius, encountered in purgatory, weeps not for his sins but for the human cost of his unredeemed life. These aren't allegorical puppets, they're fully realized characters, their voices pulsing with individuality in a way that foreshadows the Renaissance's fascination with personal experience. Dante's audacity shines brightest in his choice of guide, Virgil, the pagan poet, leading a Christian pilgrim through the afterlife. This wasn't just poetic license, it was a quiet rebellion, suggesting that classical wisdom could coexist with faith, even illuminated. By the time Renaissance thinkers like Petrarch were dusting off Roman manuscripts, Dante had already built a bridge between antiquity and his own age, treating Virgil not as a historical relic but as a living mentor. The comedy's very language reinforced this shift. While scholars still wrote in Latin, Dante chose vernacular Italian, elevating everyday speech into high art, a democratizing move that prefigured the Renaissance's push to make knowledge accessible beyond clerical elites. Perhaps most strikingly, the poem centers on Dante himself as protagonist, not as everyman, but as a specific Florentine exile with all his personal grievances and passions. When he berates corrupt popes in hell or weeps at Beatrice's mercy in paradise, we're witnessing something unprecedented, a sacred narrative filtered through one man's subjective experience. This focus on individual perspective would become a hallmark of Renaissance art, from the psychologically intense portraits of Titian to the confessional sonnets of Michelangelo. Even the comedy's intricate architecture, with its meticulously mapped circles and terraces, reflects a Renaissance-style faith in human reason's ability to systematize the divine, an idea that would later fuel everything from Brunelleschi's domes to Vesalius's anatomical charts. The real proof of Dante's foresight lies in how the Renaissance reclaimed him. Botticelli famously illustrated the comedy's hell with near-scientific precision, while Machiavelli cribbed its political critiques for his own writings. Galileo, under house arrest, lectured on the poem's astrophysics, finding in its celestial spheres a mirror for his own telescopic discoveries. By the time Michelangelo sculpted his Last Judgment, the ghost of Dante's vivid Inferno loomed large in every tormented figure. The Divine Comedy didn't just anticipate the Renaissance, it helped midwife it, proving that the seeds of humanism were already stirring in the medieval dark, waiting for the right moment to push toward the light. Benvenuto Cellini didn't just sculpt gold, he sculpted his own legacy with the same audacious flair, penning an autobiography so brash it would make modern influencers blush. At a time when personal memoirs were rare and humility was expected, Cellini's life exploded onto the scene like a firework, packed with brawls, artistic rivalries, and shameless self-promotion. Imagine a Renaissance-era tell-all, where the artist casts himself as both hero and rogue, boasting of duels won, popes insulted, and masterpieces forged under the threat of execution. This wasn't just writing, it was a performance, a defiance of the era's expectation that artists should be silent craftsmen, not stars of their own dramas. What made Cellini's memoir so revolutionary wasn't just its swagger, but its very existence. Medieval chronicles had recorded deeds of kings and saints, but rarely did a craftsman dare to claim his life as history. Cellini's opening line set the tone. All men of any worth should write their memoirs. With that, he declared individuality itself worthy of record, echoing the humanist cry that personal experience mattered as much as divine destiny. His pages brim with vivid immediacy, how he stabbed a rival in a Roman street fight, melted down church pews to cast his legendary Perseus statue, or talked his way out of a murder charge by dazzling Francis I of France with his wit. These weren't confessions, they were advertisements proving talent could trump birthright. The backlash was predictable. Critics called him a braggart, clerics seethed at his irreverence. Yet Cellini's unapologetic voice cracked open a door for others. Soon, merchants' diaries began detailing not just ledger entries but personal ambitions. Artists like Vasari penned gossipy biographies, framing creativity as drama. Even Michelangelo, though never writing an autobiography, left behind sonnets and letters dripping with personal struggle, proof that the Renaissance's cult of genius demanded more than skill, it required personality. The irony, Cellini's life almost didn't survive. The manuscript languished unpublished for over a century, deemed too scandalous for print. When it finally surfaced in the 18th century, romantic writers like Goethe devoured it, recognizing a kindred spirit who'd turned his life into art centuries before the trend. Today, his memoir reads like a proto-reality show, a testament to the Renaissance's most radical idea, that a self loudly and boldly lived could be as enduring as any statue. His gold work may gleam in museums, but his true masterpiece was the blueprint he left, proof that history belongs not just to the powerful, but to those brash enough to write themselves into it. The Vatican's galleries gleam with marble gods and gilded saints, but many of these treasures arrived through campaigns of cultural conquest that would make modern museums blush. When Pope Julius Roman II launched his ambitious plan to transform Rome into the new Athens, he didn't just commission artists, he dispatched teams to reclaim classical sculptures from across Italy, often by confiscation or outright theft. The Belvedere torso, now a cornerstone of the Vatican museums, was literally pried from the hands of a Roman cardinal who refused to part with it. The Laocoon, that writhing masterpiece of ancient agony, was dug up near Nero's Golden House and whisked to the Vatican within days. Its excavation funded by the Pope himself, who declared it too magnificent to remain in private hands. But the most audacious heist targeted the very heart of pagan Rome, the bronze doors of the Pantheon. When Pope Urban Roman VIII needed material for Bernini's baldachin in St. Peter's, he ordered the ancient bronze stripped from the temple's portico, quipping, "What the barbarians didn't destroy, the Barbarinis shall repurpose." Romans were so outraged they coined a biting pun, quod non fecerunt barbari, fecerunt barbarini. What the barbarians didn't do, the Barbarinis did. The doors had survived invasions and earthquakes only to be melted down for Catholic splendor. These weren't isolated incidents, they were policy. Popes issued edicts granting themselves first rights to any antiquities unearthed in papal territories. Excavators who discovered statues often found armed Swiss guards waiting to escort their finds to Vatican palaces. Even Raphael, as superintendent of Rome's antiquities, was tasked with cataloguing looted art for papal collections while privately lamenting the destruction of archaeological sites. The twisted genius of these campaigns, they rebranded plunder as piety. By mounting pagan statues in Vatican courtyards and baptizing them with Christian allegories. Apollo became David, Hercules morphed into Samson. The Church absorbed classical glory while asserting spiritual dominance. Bramante even designed a special courtyard, the Cortile del Belvedere, where these appropriated gods stood as trophies of Catholicism's triumph over antiquity. Yet the real casualty was context. Marbles ripped from temples lost their original meaning, becoming hollow decor for papal gardens. Frescoes hacked from catacombs were displayed as curiosities, divorced from the tombs they once guarded. Modern archaeologists still struggle to piece together sites ransacked by Renaissance treasure hunters who valued beauty over history. The Vatican's art heists reveal the Renaissance's central contradiction, a movement that revered antiquity even as it pillaged it. Those glittering galleries tell two stories, one of cultural revival, the other of calculated erasure. The past wasn't just rediscovered, it was rewritten, stone by stolen stone, into a narrative where the Church stood not as heir to antiquity, but as its conqueror. Villa d'Este's cascading fountains and manicured hedges weren't just decorative, they were a living cipher, whispering secrets about power, philosophy, and the cosmos to those who knew how to listen. Renaissance gardens like this one weren't designed for relaxation. They were theatrical stages where nature itself performed allegories, every grotto and statue placed with mathematical precision to encode hidden messages. Walk through Villa d'Este's terraces and you're traversing a three-dimensional textbook of Neoplatonic thought, where water symbolizes the soul's journey and labyrinthine paths represent the pursuit of divine knowledge. The hydraulic organ fountain, a marvel of engineering that played music using water pressure, wasn't just a party trick, it embodied the Renaissance obsession with harmonizing art and science. Its melodies echoed Pythagorean theories of musical mathematics, suggesting the universe itself vibrated with hidden order. Nearby, the Hundred Fountains corridor, with its endless rivulets trickling over carved masks, whispered a political statement. The estate's owner, Cardinal Ippolito d'Este, was proclaiming his lineage's eternal influence as relentless as these waters. Even the garden's steep slopes weren't arbitrary. They forced visitors to ascend physically, mirroring the spiritual climb toward enlightenment celebrated in humanist circles. But the real genius lay in how these symbols shifted meaning depending on the viewer's knowledge. A merchant might see the owl fountain as a quaint decoration, while a scholar would recognize it as Athena's emblem, a nod to Cardinal d'Este's intellectual pretensions. The garden's axis aligned with specific celestial events, so during summer solstice, shadows would trace paths that revealed hidden geometric patterns visible only to initiates. This was elite visual rhetoric, a way to flatter educated guests with the thrill of decoding hidden layers while excluding the uninitiated, the darker subtext. These landscapes were acts of domination over nature, over guests, even over rival families. When the Medici built their bubbly gardens, they stocked them with exotic plants from newly discovered continents, flaunting their global reach. The gushing water features at Villa Lant required rerouting entire rivers, a hydraulic flex proving one's mastery of both nature and the latest technology. Every clipped hedge and symmetrical parterre screamed control, turning wilderness into obedient geometry, yet some messages were startlingly intimate. The secluded, secret gardens, tucked behind high walls, weren't just for romantic trysts. They housed controversial plants like hellebore and mandrake, botanical references to ancient pagan rites, daringly preserved under the church's nose. Even the rustling of carefully placed cypress trees was strategic, designed to evoke Virgil's pastoral poetry for guests steeped in classical lore. What makes these gardens more than historical curiosities is their lingering influence. Their DNA lives on in everything from modern public parks to theme park design, spaces where aesthetics and ideology still intertwine. The next time you stroll through a grand garden, look closer. Those winding paths and bubbling fountains might just be speaking in a language you've forgotten how to hear. Aldus Manutius didn't just print books, he waged war on literary thieves with a ferocity that would make modern publishers blush. In the early 1500s, as his Venetian press churned out sleek, portable editions of Greek and Latin classics, counterfeiters flooded the market with cheap knockoffs, slashing his profits and butchering his meticulous scholarship with sloppy errors. But Manutius fought back with weapons no one expected: legal innovation, cunning branding, and a touch of psychological warfare. His battle didn't just protect his own work, it laid the groundwork for copyright law as we know it today. His first move was pure genius. Manutius convinced the Venetian Senate to grant him exclusive printing rights to specific Greek texts, an unprecedented privilege that effectively created the world's first intellectual property protections. These decrees, known as privileges, weren't copyright in the modern sense, but they set a crucial precedent: the idea that creative labor deserved legal recognition. When pirates ignored these rulings, Manutius turned to shame, inserting fiery diatribes into his books. One preface raged, "Thieves, know that we will pursue you not just in Venice, but to the ends of the earth." Another featured a printer's mark showing a dolphin wrapped around an anchor, symbolizing speed and stability, yes, but also serving as a branded seal buyers could trust. The counterfeiters retaliated with dirty tricks. Some copied his dolphin emblem outright, forcing Manutius to tweak his design repeatedly like a Renaissance-era logo update. Others undercut him by using cheaper paper and cramming more text onto each page, creating cramped, error-ridden editions that still sold for half the price. At one point, knockoffs of his groundbreaking italic typeface, designed to save space and mimic elegant handwriting, appeared before Manutius himself could finish printing his own books. What makes this clash so pivotal isn't just the legal firsts, but the cultural shift it represented. Before Manutius, books were seen as communal property, their contents as free as the air. By insisting that scholarship and artistry had monetary value, he helped invent the concept of the author as a profession rather than a hobby for nobles. His pocket-sized enchiridions became must-haves for Europe's rising middle class, proving that quality could trump price if consumers knew how to spot the real thing. The irony: many of Manutius's anti-piracy tactics are still in play today. Watermarks to verify authenticity, he used them, limited edition signed copies. His premium vellum editions came with handwritten dedications. Even his legal battles foreshadowed modern copyright wars. When he caught a German printer stealing his Greek typefaces, the ensuing lawsuit dragged on for years, a 1500s version of today's endless digital piracy disputes. Manutius's real victory wasn't in courtrooms or sales, though. It was in proving that ideas could be both sacred and commercial, that protecting creativity wasn't greed. It was the only way to ensure knowledge thrived. 5 centuries later, as e-books and AI strain our copyright systems anew, his fight feels startlingly fresh. The ink on those Venetian decrees may have faded, but the question they posed still lingers. Who owns wisdom, and what price should we pay to keep it alive? Sugar wasn't just a sweetener in Renaissance Europe. It was a weapon of class warfare, sculpted into towering centerpieces to proclaim wealth and power. When Venetian merchants first brought crystallized sugar from the Middle East, it cost more than its weight in silver, transforming banquet tables into theaters of conspicuous consumption. Skilled confectioners molded it into gilded swans, intricate coats of arms, even edible replicas of classical statues, each piece designed to dazzle guests before being smashed to pieces in a display of reckless extravagance. But this sugar rush wasn't just about gluttony. It marked a seismic shift in how the elite defined themselves, no longer content with simple displays of military might or land ownership. The nobility now flaunted their sophistication through culinary conquests, turning mealtimes into performative art. Yet the real revolution happened beneath the gilded surface. The fork, a controversial import from Byzantium, sparked outrage when it first appeared in Italian courts. Clergy denounced it as an insult to God who gave us fingers, while traditionalists saw the delicate utensil as emblematic of aristocratic softness. But as Renaissance ideals of refinement spread, so did the fork's popularity, creating a physical divide between those who ate with their hands and those who daintily speared their food. Suddenly, how you ate mattered as much as what you ate, with etiquette manuals dictating everything from napkin placement to the proper way to sip broth. These weren't arbitrary rules, they were social codes, separating the civilized from the vulgar masses. Meanwhile, pasta evolved from peasant sustenance to political currency. What began as a practical way to preserve flour in sun-dried sheets became a canvas for culinary innovation. The Neapolitan aristocracy commissioned elaborate shapes, stuffed ravioli for state banquets, golden saffron-infused noodles for papal visits, while commoners subsisted on plain macaroni. The duality was stark. In the same decade that Catherine de' Medici famously introduced the fork to France, Tuscan peasants still ate polenta from communal bowls with wooden spoons. Food became a map of Europe's changing landscape, with spices from newly explored trade routes signaling global influence, and local dishes like risotto asserting regional pride against the homogenizing force of empire. The darkest ingredient in this feast, chocolate, originally consumed as a bitter Aztec ritual drink, Spanish conquistadors sweetened it with cane sugar and vanilla, creating an addictive luxury that flooded European courts. But behind its frothy allure lay a brutal truth. Every sip depended on enslaved labor in Caribbean sugar plantations and Mesoamerican cacao fields. The Renaissance's culinary revolution wasn't just about taste, it was the first bite of globalization, where pleasure and oppression simmered in the same pot. What makes this era's food culture so pivotal is how thoroughly it mirrors the Renaissance's contradictions. For every sugar sculpture celebrating human creativity, there was a starving artist paid in bread crusts. For every treatise on table manners, there were back-alley taverns where scholars debated philosophy over shared trenchers. The fork may seem trivial now, but its adoption marked a turning point the moment Europe began to equate refinement with progress, setting the table for modernity itself. The next time you twirl spaghetti on your fork, remember, you're reenacting a 500-year-old performance of power, one bite at a time. Giulio Camillo's Memory Theatre wasn't just a study aid, it was a Renaissance-era supercomputer built from imagination and symbolism. Picture a physical wooden structure large enough to walk through, its tiers and compartments representing the entire universe of human knowledge. To modern eyes, it might seem like an eccentric art installation, but for 16th century scholars, this was cutting-edge cognitive technology. Camillo claimed his theater could allow anyone to instantly recall vast swaths of information by mentally walking through its symbolic chambers, where every image, from mythological figures to celestial diagrams, acted as a hyperlink to stored knowledge. His patrons, including the King of France, poured fortunes into its development, believing it might unlock the secret to perfect memory. The method traced back to ancient Roman orators who visualized elaborate palaces in their minds, placing facts in specific rooms to retrieve during speeches. But Camillo took this further by externalizing the system. Each of his theater's 7 levels corresponded to a different realm of wisdom, classical texts, divine mysteries, scientific principles, all mapped onto vivid icons. A carving of Hercules might anchor lessons on strength and labor, while a painted zodiac sign could hold astronomical data. The genius lay in how these images leveraged the brain's natural knack for visual and spatial recall. Modern neuroscience confirms what Renaissance thinkers intuited. Our brains retain emotionally charged or bizarre imagery far better than dry lists. What made Camillo's theater revolutionary was its theatricality. Unlike dusty manuscripts, his system embraced drama and storytelling as mnemonic fuel. Visitors didn't just memorize, they performed mental pilgrimages, engaging multiple senses to cement knowledge. This wasn't rote learning, it was intellectual alchemy, turning abstract ideas into tangible experiences. Rival scholars scoffed, accusing him of peddling occult nonsense, but even critics couldn't deny the system's power. When philosopher Giordano Bruno later adapted these techniques, he used them to catalog thousands of esoteric symbols, proving their scalability, the real tragedy. The original memory theater vanished, likely destroyed as Camillo's funding dried up. Only his cryptic notes survive, leaving historians to reconstruct its design like detectives piecing together a lost cipher. Yet its legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern memory athletes still use virtual palaces to memorize decks of cards, and even tech companies now design virtual reality learning environments that eerily echo Camillo's vision. His wooden theater may have crumbled, but the idea behind it endures. That knowledge, when dressed in the robes of art and narrative, becomes unforgettable. The term Dark Ages wasn't coined by historians. It was a Renaissance marketing ploy, a deliberate smear campaign by scholars desperate to make their own era shine brighter by comparison. When Petrarch and later humanists dismissed the 1,000 years between Rome's fall and their own time as a cultural wasteland, they weren't describing reality. They were crafting an origin story that painted themselves as heroic revivalists awakening Europe from intellectual slumber. The truth, many so-called Renaissance breakthroughs were actually medieval innovations wearing new clothes. Take universities. Long before Botticelli picked up a brush, institutions like Bologna and Oxford were thriving centers of debate, preserving and expanding knowledge in law, medicine, and philosophy. The architectural marvel of Gothic cathedrals with their soaring vaults and precise geometry proved medieval builders weren't primitive. They were engineering geniuses who solved structural puzzles Renaissance architects later claimed as their own. Even the printing press, often hailed as a Renaissance invention, relied on medieval advances in papermaking and metalworking that took centuries to perfect. The myth crumbles further when you examine art. Giotto's revolutionary lifelike frescoes in the early 1400s didn't spring from nowhere. They built on centuries of Byzantine experimentation with perspective and emotion. The illuminated manuscripts, painstakingly crafted by monastic scribes, preserved classical texts the humanists later rediscovered. Their elaborate borders and gold leaf proving medieval artists valued beauty as much as piety. Even the Renaissance's beloved Greek classics survived because Arab and Byzantine scholars, falsely lumped into the Dark Era, had meticulously translated and annotated them. Why does this misconception persist? Because history is written by the victorious, in this case, Renaissance elites, who needed to justify their cultural revolution. By painting the Middle Ages as stagnant, they made their own work seem more radical. But the real story is one of continuous evolution, where 12th century translators in Toledo laid the groundwork for 15th century humanism, where medieval troubadours' love poems foreshadowed Petrarch's sonnets, where the compass and heavy plough. Both medieval inventions made the age of exploration possible. The greatest irony, in their zeal to distance themselves from the past, Renaissance thinkers overlooked their own debt to it, that cathedral spire pointing heavenward. It's the same spiritual longing you'll find in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. The scholastic debates of Thomas Aquinas, they primed Europe for the intellectual ferment of Erasmus and Galileo. The Dark Ages weren't dark, they were the long dawn that made the Renaissance sunrise possible. Peel away the propaganda, and you'll find an unbroken thread of curiosity and creativity, stretching from Charlemagne's scriptoria to Da Vinci's notebooks, proving brilliance never went extinct, it just changed costumes. So there you have it, the Renaissance wasn't the tidy rebirth of classical glory we've been sold. It was a wild, messy collision of plague survivors and book hunters, stolen antiquities and smuggled manuscripts, where Arab mathematicians and Byzantine refugees quietly shaped Europe's so-called rediscovery of knowledge. The Medicis didn't just fund art, they weaponized it. The printing press didn't just spread ideas, it turned them into contraband, and those radiant masterpieces. Many were painted with pigments mined by enslaved workers, their beauty shadowed by brutality. Think about the contradictions we've uncovered. A movement that celebrated humanism yet silenced women like Sophonisba Anguissola. An era of scientific leaps where Galileo lived under house arrest for daring to look through a telescope. The Borgias preached piety while turning the Vatican into a stage for murder, and the very term Renaissance was a 19th century label slapped onto a far more complicated reality. Even Shakespeare might have stolen his best material from Italian alleyways during his mysterious lost years. The biggest lie of all, that this was Europe's solo triumph. Without the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the scholars of Toledo, or the Ethiopian diplomats who brought African cosmology to Florence, the Renaissance as we know it wouldn't exist. It wasn't a revival, it was a remix with contributions from 3 continents and countless cultures history tried to erase. Now it's your turn. Which of these 30 facts rewired your understanding of the Renaissance? Was it the Black Death's accidental role as a catalyst, or the Vatican's art heists disguised as piety? The alchemists who birthed modern chemistry while chasing mythical stones, or the forgotten women whose paintings were literally painted over by men? Drop your answer in the comments. Let's keep unraveling history's tangled threads together. Because the past isn't set in stone, it's waiting to be questioned, just like those hidden symbols in Botticelli's Primavera. The real masterpiece, discovering how much we're still learning.